Bill, before we start, right, a bit of an introduction into this. The concept is real leader. It's called the Real Leaders Project, and the inspiration was that there's nothing more inspiring than real stories. And we thought we would go out and interview and get stories from the people who inspire us, right? And this turns out to be it range from folks who've started companies to folks who've written great books, etc., etc., etc. So this little team essentially goes out and interviews all these people and yeah, collects these insights and stories. It's literally as simple as that. And I was super inspired to interview you thanks to two books, actually. The first one is The Splendid Exchange, which I rank as probably one of the best books I've ever read. And then I've recently read The Investor's Manifesto, about which I have a whole bunch of questions. So, kind of looking forward to getting to know your story, as well as sort of understanding a little bit more about why you do what you do. The first question, Bill, is my favorite. Is would be great to get your background, but more on the view of how you ended up doing what you do now, and why. Why did you take up writing specifically, and then writing about finance, and then finance and history? So what's the story?
Well, it's basically, as you might expect, a shaggy dog story. I practiced medicine in the United States for a long time. And, this is a country that doesn't have a functioning social welfare system. So you have to save for your own retirement. And I did what I thought that any person with scientific training would do, which is to read the peer-reviewed literature about finance, to read basic textbooks, the best accepted academic textbooks, and that would tell me what to do. Well, it didn't really tell me exactly what to do, but it told me that I was going to have to do some more things, which was to collect my own data and to run my own models. And that turned out to be a chore because back 15, 20 years ago, the data that I needed weren't available. You had to beg, steal, or borrow it, so I did that. And then I learned to spreadsheet. Most doctors don't know how to use spreadsheets, or at least they certainly didn't 20 years ago. And I began building my models. And after I was all done, and I had figured out exactly what I was going to do with my investing career, I realized that I had figured something out that other small investors would find useful. So I began writing finance books. The first one was The Intelligent Asset Allocator, and it took, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years to finally get published. And you discover that when you write about finance, you have to know history. It's just like, the law or military science in that regard. If you don't know the history of what you're doing, you're dead in the water. I mean, this is what happened to the guys, for example, in 1998 with long-term capital management. These were the most brilliant people in finance, but they quite obviously didn't have a working knowledge of financial history. And they didn't realize that, the system from time to time became chaotic and all the usual relationships would break down. But this is something that if you understand financial history, becomes very obvious very quickly. And I discovered I enjoyed writing history, so after writing a couple of finance books, I went to my publisher, which was McGraw-Hill, and I said, I'd like to write a history of the world economy. And they said, sure, give it a crack. And so I wrote The Birth of Plenty, and that succeeded well enough that it became a calling card for The Splendid Exchange, which was the book that you finally read.
The first set of questions will be around investing, since you've written a bunch of great books. The Four Pillars is a popular one, and The Investor's Manifesto. So I think I'd like to pass on a compliment first. A friend of mine called Derek Sivers, he is a technology entrepreneur who sold his company called cdbaby.com and made 22 million. And what he essentially did was followed your investment advice to the letter, put it all in a charitable trust, rebalances his portfolio every year, and has been doing it for about, 6 years or so. And he says it works brilliantly, and he wanted to thank you because you've effectively helped him manage his life. So a huge compliment there. And I think Derek then came up with the question, which I think is a question that a problem that I face as well. A lot of your advice is very US based. And the good news for Derek was he did all of this in the US, but he's now moved to Singapore and in New Zealand. And his question to you, and my question as well, is what sort of advice do you have for us? We have two fundamental problems. One, we don't have Vanguard, so easily available. Two, a lot of your portfolio weightages are weighted towards the US. How would you, how would your advice change for people living outside?
Well, obviously, you would want to own more of your home market and less of the U.S. And a good place to start might be a third of each of them. So a third of your home market, a third of the U.S., and a third of everything else in the world. Wouldn't be a bad way to do it. I'm sure there are more efficient ways to do it. But there is a fellow by the name of Andrew Hallam, Hallam,
Okay.
who actually has written a book for, I believe, people who live in Australia, Canada, and Singapore, and maybe one or two
I see.
Other places as well. Hallam.
Okay.
I think the book is The Millionaire Teacher. And it's quite engaging. I could be wrong about that. It's quite an engaging book.
Yeah.
And secondly, thank Derek for the kind words. I actually get this fairly commonly, although very rarely from people with 22 million.
Exactly.
Unless maybe it's 22 million yen.
No.
And I really, it's part of the psychic taking out of being an author. How often people will tell you that you've saved their financial lives.
That's fantastic. So the next question, and this is again another personal question. I'm 24 now, and we obviously have a whole bevy of friends who are all just getting into this concept of investing and having a little bit of money. And everybody, at least our parents' generation's advice is go buy a house. Right? And I think I'd like to understand your thesis on houses as investments. A little bit around your 100 multiply the rent by 150 rationale, and how do we look at houses, right? Are these investments, or are we just kind of doing what everybody else does? So your thesis on that would be very helpful.
Well, a house is an investment. It's a consumption item. You have to live in a house. And you can rent or you can own. That's essentially a financial decision. But you should never, ever consider it part of your net wealth, because it's something that you need to have. It's sort of like counting, I don't know, your PC as part of your net worth. You need a PC. Why should you include it in your net worth? Now, what you're referring to is what I call the rule of 168, which is how make a rental value and a purchase value equivalent.
Yeah.
So let's say you've got an apartment that you're renting for $1,000 a month.
Yeah.
Well, what that tells you is that you shouldn't pay more than $168,000 for a condo that basically looks the same to you. All of that comes from the number 168 is simply 14 years worth of rent. That is, a normal price to rent ratio. And so if you're paying, much more than 168 months rent for a residence, you're probably paying too much. And if you can pay a lot less than that, you're probably doing well. For example, I live in Portland, and I can tell you that a place in Portland that would rent for $1,000 a month is probably going to cost you at least $200,000 or $250,000. Well, that's a bad ratio. On the other hand, if you were to go to Florida or someplace out in the middle of Nevada, a place that you would rent there for $1,000 a month, you could probably pick up $50,000. Well, that's a good deal, all right, because that's a price to rent ratio of just 50 months or 4 years. So that's how that number works.
So now there's another follow-up question. So a friend of mine had an interesting view on this. He said, look, I'm fairly geographically mobile. I have an option to buy a house at home, which is what sort of my parents want me to do. I have an option to buy a home in Singapore, which is where I'm based, or I also have an option to invest in a house in, say, Malaysia, which seems to be coming up, which wants to attract foreign investors, and you don't need to put in massive amounts to invest. How do I look at all of this? Does this make sense, or am I just looking at this the wrong way? Should I just be taking that money and putting it into an index fund, for example?
Well, buying real estate and renting it out, doing real estate as a business, isn't an investment; it's a job. And if you enjoy fixing toilets and dealing with drug-addled tenants, it's not a bad job. But when you're looking at whether to buy a place here or there, you again use the price to rent ratio.
Yeah.
Now that's not to say that Singapore is going to be the next London,
Yeah.
as it appears to be happening, at least from what I understand.
Yes.
And you could do very well in real estate, or Malaysia might be the next, Fort Lauderdale or,
Yeah.
or Orlando,
Yeah.
Which is not a good thing. So they're obviously all else isn't equal there, but that's price to rent is a good place to start.
Got it. So now the next, I think these were the sort of the investing section. I'm most interested in the history section. So now that you wrote Splendid Exchange, right? I'd love to understand, one, what the motivation was, and two, what were your biggest sort of reflections or learnings from it? Like I had a whole bunch of things going through my head as I finished that book. But it would be kind of very interesting to see your view as you sort of dug through all that history and put it all in one story.
Well, first of all, the story of how I came to write it, my motivation was very straightforward, which is that I had just finished the Birth of Plenty,
Yeah.
and I got a phone call from a man by the name of Brando Skyhorse. And Brando is an acquisitions editor at Grove Atlantic Press. And he calls me up and says, would like you to write a history of world trade. And I said, well, I don't know anything about it. I'm not terribly interested in it. And by the way, you've got the wrong Bernstein. You want Peter Bernstein. And there was this sort of awkward silence at the end of the line. And I went out from my den into our family room where my wife was finishing her morning coffee and the New York Times crossword puzzle. And I told her what had happened. And she put down the crossword puzzle and she put down her coffee. And she looked at me and she said, you know who Grove Atlantic Press is? And I said, well, not really. She said, well, did you know who Grove Press is? And I said, well, yeah, that's Doris Lessing and P.J. O'Rourke, going further back, Henry Miller. And she said, right. And you've heard of the Atlantic Monthly? And I said, yeah, I've heard of them too. She said, that's Grove Atlantic Press. If you value your career as a nonfiction writer, you will write whatever it is they want you to write. So that's how I came to write Splendid Exchange. I wasn't strongly motivated. By the way, they had talked to Peter Bernstein. And what Peter had said was, I can't do it because I'm writing my history of the Erie Canal. But there's this other Bernstein who might be interested. So I dug into the project, and of course it was a fascinating project. But I didn't know two things when I started the project. One is I didn't know that Brando's boss, a man by the name of Morgan Intricate, who basically owns or manages the imprint, is a publishing genius and is able to identify, superb commercially viable subjects. And what he knew that I didn't was that because the history of world trade is soaked with sex, violence, luxury goods, and mass death, it was going to make a compelling narrative and a compelling book. And that was what I quickly found out and became enchanted with as I wrote the book. I mean, one of the things you try and do as a nonfiction author is to find the most compelling narratives you can, and they were all over the place with this particular subject. It was quite a pleasure.
Wow. Okay, so behind every successful man, there definitely is a woman, right?
Oh yeah. Well, I haven't even mentioned to you the largest publishing asset that my wife brings to the table, which is she can edit.
Okay.
And I'll frequently, I mean, my standard procedure with every book that I read or that I write is to bring her a chapter, and she'll look at it and she'll say, "What intonation are you trying to say?" And I'll tell her, and she said, "Well, then say it. Here's how you do it." And I'll give her, a second draft, and she'll say, "Oh, this is getting better, but you still need to do this and this and this." And finally, I'll give her a third draft, and she'll sort of look at it and say, "Oh, all right. I guess you can send it to your publisher now. It's okay." And so that's without her, I would be dead in the water.
So do you do this, and is it, I know, so you started as a doctor, you then started doing some financial writing. Now I see you've written a book on history of communication. So is this what you do now? What is this the full-time job? Is this the career?
I have no full-time jobs at the moment. I spend a lot of time managing money.
Yeah.
Because we have a financial advisory service.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time reading and writing, and hope to continue to do until I'm pushing up the daisies.
Yeah.
And I spend a lot of time traveling, and I'm spending increasing amount of time with my first grandchild. So everything in moderation. You need a balance in your life. So that's what I'm trying to do, is balance my life at this point.
So here's the question, and this is probably one you get asked all the time. The last 6 years have been pretty dismal financially. And every time we seem to come out of the recession, we seem to kind of lean back into it again. What is your take been of the times? And yes, there have been equals or parallels in financial history, but what I'm struggling to see is something as sustained as this, and I just wonder how long it will take for all of this to be cleaned up. For example, the Eurozone doesn't seem to be getting any cleaner as the years progress. So kind of curious to get your view.
Well, there are really two questions in there. First, is there anything unusual, and what is unusual about this era? And the answer is nothing. Between, I think it was 1966 and 1982 or so, there was, the U.S. stock market had a zero real total return. In other words, after inflation, the return was zero for 17 solid years. So there's nothing unusual with the period of stagnation. Now, the other thing you learn from financial history, and maybe the most valuable thing you learn from financial history, is that the best fishing is done in the most troubled waters. The times that you make the most money is when you buy stocks the cheapest. Well, stocks don't become very cheap without a really good reason. You go back in financial history and just run the numbers, and you ask yourself, what were the best times to buy stock? Well, that was in 1932, July of 1932, when things looked, not just awful, but apocalyptic.
Yeah.
1982 was a spectacularly good time to buy stocks.
Yeah.
And March of 2009 was a pretty good time to buy stocks as well. What did the world look like, in 2009 and 1982 and in 1932? It looked like the world was about to end.
Yeah.
And any rational person would have said, heuristically, this is not a good time to buy stocks. I want to wait until the sky clears. But if you wait until the sky clears, it's too late. The best time to buy stocks is when things look the worst. So, if you're telling me that Europe looks terrible, then I'm buying European stocks, thanks.
Okay, so here's I guess changing track to sort of a personal question. One is, what do you do to stay productive? You do a bunch of things now, and it seems like your days are pretty filled up. I think taking care of your grandchild itself would be a fairly busy job, and in addition to managing money and writing these books and reading, is there any science to the madness, and are there any routines, habits, or something that help you stay productive and energized?
We have a toy in the United States. It's a small straw toy called a Chinese finger puzzle. Is that something that goes culturally? It's a little straw tube that if you pull on it too hard, it tightens up, and so the trick is actually to push together. Well, creativity, literary creativity, financial creativity is just like that. The less you do, the more creative that you are. Show me a person who works 80 or 70 or 80 hours a week, and I'll show you a person who's never had an original thought in their life, because you just don't have the time to have them. And that was something I realized very early on in my career. When I was a graduate student in the sciences, the times when I was the most productive were actually the times that I was working the least, and I had the most free time. Now, it's funny because people ask me, um, when do you sleep? That's usually the first question that somebody asks me who's meeting me for the first time, because they see all these different areas that I'm active in. And the answer is, if I work 3 or 4 hours or 5 hours in a given day, that's a lot of hours. I have to, I've got to recover from that. And I will frequently take 4 weeks off here and there to travel, and not feel stressed when I come back, to get the work done. Well, aside which, in this day and age, it really doesn't matter where you are anymore.
Yes.
You can be on top of the Himalayas and still get work done if you need to get the work done.
Yes.
So it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. I used to joke when people said, "What's your goal in life?" And I said, "Well, it's to take a suitcase full of books to Provence for 6 weeks and call it work." And the funny thing is that now that I've gotten there, I don't have to carry the books along around anymore.
You have a Kindle.
Because I've got a Kindle and I've got it sort of came home to me. We were on a train several years ago in Scandinavia, and I was just reading an article online on the train, on this train going from Copenhagen to Stockholm, and it referenced a subject I was interested in. So I went into JSTOR and was able to find a 30-year-old academic article that pertained to traveling across the Swedish countryside at 100 miles an hour. It was quite a revelation for somebody of my age.
No,
if you're 9 years old, it's normal, but if you're 65 years old, it's not normal.
No, and I agree, right? And I at least, it's funny, we turned probably the Google switch in Asia when I was probably in university a few years ago. So sort of I've seen a little bit of the old, and I've seen now, and I still find it amazing. I still remember listening to the Splendid Exchange as I was walking down a street in Singapore or traveling on a bus, and I thought, this is so cool. I have a private narration of the history of the financial world, as I'm doing something else, right? It just felt really, really amazing. Great time to be alive.
Indeed.
So the final question, this one is, what is an idea or thought that inspires you, that you would like to share?
The careers are grossly overrated. If you really want to accomplish something, don't put yourself into a deep, long rut that's going to eat up, decades and decades of your life. You have to. I mean, I hate to go all James Campbell on you, but you have to follow your bliss and do whatever the heck it is you want to do. And the only other, vaguely inspirational thing that I can tell people is, if you're thinking of writing as a career, the writing is really just a byproduct, at least from my perspective. What you're really doing is you're using your writing project to direct your reading in a productive and fascinating and very satisfying way. I'll typically read 50 to 100,000 pages whenever I produce one of my long-form nonfiction books, and that's the real reward, is learning a subject very, very deeply.
That is very inspiring. Bill, thank you so much for taking the time. I would love to be in touch, and I will be in touch. I love your books, and I'm looking forward to all the future editions of all the future books.
Okay, my pleasure, sir.
Have a great day, and thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.